Good morning, boys and girls in fourth grade. I wanted to introduce to you a unit that we teach every year. It's one of our IFL units, and it's called When Disaster Strikes. And it's a study of a couple of stories, both written by Lauren Tarshish, and they are man-made disasters, little man-made disasters that a lot of people don't know about in history, but once you read about them, you're kind of shocked because of the devastation that happens. We know a disaster is something that happens that causes destruction in some kind of way. There's man-made disasters, there's natural disasters, things that happen in nature like tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes and things like this. But both of these disasters that we're going to read about had some man-made causes. And one of the skills that we teach with this is cause and effect. And cause and effect is a skill that a lot of authors will use to help a reader be able to really understand and comprehend complex text by helping you to see how things happen, what was the cause of them, and what was the result of them. For example, if you had the sentence that said, our internet went out, so I was unable to watch my favorite show, you might think, well, what happened? Well, I wasn't able to watch my show. Well, what caused that? My internet went out. So my internet went out was the cause. The effect of that was you weren't able to watch your favorite show. So often you'll see, and sometimes in informational text particularly, you'll see authors use that technique. And so we want to kind of think about, as we're reading through this text, what are all the causes and what were the effects of the things that man did to cause this? And then also thinking about what could have happened to prevent this. Now, one neat thing about this particular story, it was written by Lauren Tarshish, and I know a lot of you may think, that name sounds a little familiar. If you've ever read any of the I Survive series, she's the author of those. And so it makes a lot of sense that she would write these too. Now, those are historical fiction books. These are actually authentic informational textbooks. These really did happen. There's nothing fictional about what I'm about to read to you today. And for Ms. Denson and my blog, we've sent you a couple of videos that you can kind of watch to see some of the primary sources that were taken during that time. So some photographs and really kind of some rough videos and things that were taken, along with some things that were reenacted to show you what that time frame was like. So I'm going to go ahead and read the story to you. We've sent the story to our two blogs so that you can maybe print it out. You can read along with me if you have the story, or just listen to the story and have a discussion maybe with someone at your house about what caused this and maybe what could have prevented this. All right, the Boston Molasses Flood of 1919 by Lauren Tarshish. 90-something years ago, a strange and terrible disaster struck Boston. A killer wave of molasses crashed through a crowded neighborhood. The wave was 15 feet tall, traveling at 35 miles per hour. It destroyed everything in its path and killed 21 people. How did this happen? And who was to blame? Now, thinking about a wave 15 foot tall, think about how tall you are. I'm about 5'2". A lot of you are close to that too in fourth grade already. But think about that and then multiply it by like 3 times and think about how tall that wave of molasses would have been. Now, last week we sent you some videos and some things so you can maybe learn about what molasses was. We learned that molasses is a very, very thick, syrupy material that's made after burning and boiling sugar cane down to get the really deepest, richest sweetness from that. And some of you even use the video to make some molasses cookies. And I know those probably tasted pretty good. Eating molasses on its own, it's kind of almost a really thick, it's sweet, but it has really a strong bitter taste to it. But used in baking, if you've ever made things like gingerbread or gingerbread cookies, molasses cookies, sometimes pumpkin pie and pecan pie has this in there. In baking, it adds a really wonderful sweet richness to food. So if you haven't tried or want to go back and look at that video to see how to make those cookies, do so. I encourage you. All right, so let's get into the story. It was a bright January day in 1919, and young Anthony DeStasio hurried along a crowded sidewalk in Boston's North End. As usual, the streets were crowded with honking motor cars and clattering horse-drawn wagons. After weeks of freezing cold, the day was warm and sunny. Anthony's tattered wool coat flapped open as he hurried toward the tiny apartment where he lived with his parents and 3 sisters. Like most of the people who lived in this poor Boston neighborhood, Anthony's family had come from southern Italy, eager to start a new and better life in America. So Anthony was a family of immigrants that had come over from Italy to settle in Boston. And as you know from studying Boston in social studies and in reading, that was where a lot of our early American history took place. We've studied the Boston Tea Party and a lot of things that happened there, the Boston Massacre. So it's a town right there, a big, busy port town, so a very important city. What they found was hardship. Anthony's father worked long hours on the waterfront. Anthony's mother struggled to make their dingy 2-room apartment into a decent home, to chase away the cockroaches and to cover up the stink of garbage and horse manure that wafted up from the streets. Life was tough for the people of the North End, and the past 2 years had been especially challenging, not only for them, but for most Americans. So if we think about also during that time period, you can kind of talk about it with your parents. In 1919, we were starting to see a time period in our country where a lot of economical struggle was starting to happen. And we studied in reading economy, the economics, that has to do with the way people make their money. And in 1919, we were starting to enter into a period that was called the Great Depression. So not only were these immigrants really struggling on this North End side of Boston, but a lot of people in our whole entire country were struggling as well. And then also you'll see there was a war. World War I was raging during this time too. So it was a really tough time in our country's history. World War I had been raging in Europe. More than 4 million American soldiers had joined the brutal fight to defeat Germany. During the final months of the war, another horror hit the world: the influenza epidemic of 1918. 50 million people died, including more than 600,000 Americans. And if that is not a timely coincidence in our history right now, as we're thinking about the coronavirus, how it is affecting everything that's going on right now. So in 1919, that was happening in America, the influenza epidemic. And perhaps your parents can let you have a little bit of time to talk about that and look up some information about that. It says that 50 million people died, including more than 600,000 Americans. That was the influenza epidemic then. Now, though the war and the epidemic were over, Anthony might even have sensed a mood of hopefulness on this bright January day. The residents of Boston's North End had every reason to believe that better times were just ahead, but they were not. Something terrible was about to strike Anthony's neighborhood. In fact, the deadly threat had been looming over the North End for years. It was not a German bomb or a deadly disease. It was a giant steel tank filled with molasses. And the next section is called From Pies to Bombs. Molasses is a thick brown syrup that was once the most popular sweetener in America. Like white sugar, molasses comes from the sugarcane plant, which grows in the Caribbean and other hot and humid regions. Until the late 1800s, white sugar was so expensive that only rich people could afford it. Molasses was the cheap alternative. So, despite the bitter taste, it was molasses that sweetened early Americans' tasty treats like pumpkin pie and Indian pudding. Indian pudding is a kind of a cornmeal-based dessert. It was really inexpensive to make, and a lot of people in America would eat that because it was a cheap way to get a nice dessert in after your dinner. By the 1900s, sugar prices had dropped and most Americans no longer needed to sweeten their foods with molasses. So the sticky brown syrup was put to a new and surprising use, making bombs. Heated up in a process called distillation, molasses can be turned into industrial alcohol. In this liquid form, molasses became a key ingredient to the explosives used in the war against Germany. Throughout World War I, ships loaded with millions of gallons of molasses arrived at Boston's port. Trains would then take the gooey cargo to distilleries where it was turned into industrial alcohol. So from a dessert sweetener all the way to a distilled alcohol, industrial alcohol, and then used to make parts of a bomb. In 1914, the leaders of one molasses company, the United States Industrial Alcohol, decided to build an enormous molasses storage tank near Boston Harbor. The tank was constructed hastily, which means really fast, and it was huge, bigger than any tank ever built in Boston. As if the North End weren't already grim enough, now there was this 5-story steel tank towering above the neighborhood, blotting out the sun and blocking the view of the harbor. So imagine waking up in the morning and looking out your window and all you can see is this big 5-story tank that they were building to fill with all of this molasses that they were shipping in to the harbor. So thinking now about some cause and effects, we can kind of already start to see some things that were happening. This tank was built hastily, really quickly. So think about when you build something or make something really, really fast. And is that always your best work? It does always come out to be something that works for you. Also, they're shipping in lots and lots and lots of this molasses so that they can make into an industrial alcohol because they need to make bombs for the war. So let's continue reading. So keep those things in your mind. It wasn't only the tank's unsightliness that upset the residents of the North End, though. A few hours after the tank was filled with molasses for the first time, the brown syrup began leaking from the seams, oozing like blood from invisible wounds. Every time the tank was refilled with molasses, it rumbled and groaned as though the steel walls were crying out in pain. Now, what kind of figurative language is that? Crying out in pain. We know that people do that, and this big tank is making a noise that kind of seems like that. We call that personification, giving a human quality to something that's not human, such as the tank. Some people living near the tank were worried that it was unsafe. But what could they do about it? USIA was a big company, and the people of the North End were poor and powerless. In the early 20th century, many Americans viewed immigrants with suspicion and prejudice. Even a person bold enough to complain about the dangerous tank would have had a hard time finding someone willing to listen and to help. So we see some people that are looking down upon the immigrants, maybe because they're poor, they're from another country, and they're thinking less of them because of that. We've talked about that a lot in some of our reading lessons. When we think about somebody less than us, what happens when that when those feelings are presented? That's a prejudice. And so the years passed. The molasses kept leaking, and the noise of the straining steel grew louder until the moment on that bright January day in 1919 when Anthony DeStasio was making his way home. A violent swirl. The first sign of disaster was a strange sound, rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat. It was the sound of thousands of steel rivets popping out of place. And do you know what that figurative language is called when you see a sound made in our written piece? Rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat. We can call that two things. We can call it onomatopoeia. That's a sound word. That's a really funny word. But also when you study poetry this week with us, we talk about something called repetition. When you take sometimes a sound or We have a phrase that's repeated over and over. It's repetition. The author does that to call your attention to something really important that's going to happen. This was the sound of 1,000 rivets popping out of place. After years of strain, the molasses tank was breaking apart. People froze, and then came the thundering explosion. "Run!" a man screamed. "It's the tank!" Anthony looked up just as the molasses tank cracked apart like a massive egg. You see a little figurative language there with a simile. So this tank cracking apart like a massive egg. It was unleashing 2.3 millions of gallons of thick, sticky molasses. The molasses formed a colossal brown wave, 15 feet high, 160 feet wide, and traveling at a staggering 35 miles per hour. The syrup was far heavier and more destructive than a wave of ocean water, and it moved with incredible power and speed. Within seconds, it had crushed several wooden houses and flattened a 3-story fire station. It swept away motor cars and snapped electrical poles. Anthony and dozens of others were quickly caught in the violent swirl. The wave pulled Anthony under. Molasses gushed into his mouth. He was carried for several blocks until he crashed into a metal lamppost hard. The impact knocked him out. A firefighter, spotting Anthony pinned against the lamppost, rushed through the waist-deep molasses and grabbed Anthony just before he could be swept away. And think about if you've ever been in a swimming pool or in the ocean and you try to run in the water, it's hard. That pressure of the water against your body creates a force that makes the weight heavier for you. So you're like running in slow motion. So multiply that density of the water and picture that being a thick honey syrup. How hard that would be to run in that. It would be just almost impossible. But this firefighter sees Anthony being washed away by the molasses, and he's trying to rescue him. The firefighter held Anthony's limp body and looked at the molasses-coated face. The poor boy, the firefighter believed, had not survived. By the time the wave lost its power, half a mile of the north end was flooded with molasses. Hundreds of firefighters, police officers, nurses, and sailors from docked ships rushed to the scene. They freed people trapped under the collapsed building and tangled in molasses-soaked debris. Plain water did little to wash the thick, syrupy molasses away. Instead, firefighters used salt water to scour the hardening goo from the streets. In the end, 21 people were killed and 150 were injured. The strangest disaster. Within hours of the explosion, leaders of the USIA were insisting that the disaster was not their fault. Their tank, they claimed, had been bombed by criminals. But few believed this explanation. You know, whenever a disaster happens and it's man-made, there's always people rushing to blame somebody. In the following weeks, experts sifted through the wreckage, inspecting the remains of the tank. They spoke to residents who had seen the leaks and heard the strange noises. The experts' conclusion? The tank had been shoddily built, and the leaders of the USIA had known about it. Still, the USIA refused to take responsibility, and at first it seemed the company would not be held responsible. But the victims persisted in their demand for justice. They filed a lawsuit, and the trial dragged on for years. Finally, USIA was forced to pay $1 million, which would be equal to about $7 million today. For the poor immigrants of the North End, it was a big victory. It took years for the North End to rebuild after the flood. Even today, on hot days, some claim that the sweet scent of molasses rises up like a ghost. But somehow the disaster has been largely forgotten. Because, I mean, have you ever heard about this before? I'd never heard of this before until I read this passage. Indeed, few have ever heard about the molasses flood of 1919 and the incredible stories from that day, like the story of Anthony DeStasio. Anthony was taken to a large building used to store the bodies of those who had died in the flood, and he was covered with a sheet. But Anthony was not dead. He was only unconscious. Hours later, he woke to the sound of his mother's voice calling him. He tried to answer, but his mouth was so full of molasses. Suddenly, he sat up, and soon his family surrounded him. They were a lucky survivor of the strangest disaster in American history. So if you are in Miss Phyllis and Miss Denson's class, we also sent you a printout of a cause and effect sheet. You're welcome to print this out and do it if you want to talk about it with your families or someone in your home. In it, we're thinking about listing, it says, what were some of the causes of the molasses flood? And what's the evidence in the story that shows you that? And then how could you think about the results of those causes? And how could you explain those causes and what they did? What they did ended up being the results. And there's a lot of the results that came from that, and lots of little bitty causes that, that also go along with that. So I hope that you enjoy this story and that you can spend some time maybe looking at some of the videos that we sent you through our email, and that you will also be able to think about maybe looking up some other man-made disasters on the websites if your parents will let you do that. Next week, we're going to focus on another man-made disaster called the Peshtigo fires. And if you want to start kind of taking a sneak peek, you can be looking up that too. I hope you have a great day and look forward to talking to you and reading some more stories with you.